The Bible is over 40% narrative. Now that means that if we misunderstand how to interpret the Bible stories, we miss out on almost half of the Bible. So we need to understand how to interpret historical narrative. So let's look at its definition, classification, and interpretation. First, definition. A historical narrative is simply a fancy way of saying an account of actual history. People usually use it instead of the word story because story might give the impression that it's made up. So a historical narrative, though, is basically just a story. Next, it's classification. When we look at stories, they're all what we might call bottom-level stories. These are just the actual individual stories that occur in the Bible. But more than that, these individual stories combine to make up what we might call middle-level stories, or bigger arches or spanning themes. And then all of these middle-level stories combine to make what we might call the top-level story, the main story of what the Bible teaches. What the Bible teaches, the main story might be like the book, and the middle-level stories, well, those might be like the chapters. So when we study stories, we need to understand them at the bottom level, but we also need to understand how they fit in and contribute to the middle level stories. And then we also need to understand how these bottom level stories and middle level stories contribute to the big theme of what God is doing in the Bible. Okay, now let's look at interpretation. And first we're going to consider some pitfalls or some traps that people often fall into. The first pitfall is what I call the ought trap. This is confusing what did happen with what ought to happen. Just because a hero of the faith did something doesn't mean that that's a pattern for us to follow. King David, as good as he was, had several wives. That doesn't mean that God condones polygamy or that we should have several wives. So make sure you don't confuse what did happen with what ought to happen. The second trap is what I'd call the allegory trap. This is seeing everything in a story as symbolic, so that way it can fit a particular need that you're having right now. Maybe you're a preacher and you're trying to put together a sermon, and so you symbolize every account in a story so that way you've got good preaching material. Or maybe you've got some problem in your life and you're desperate for God's answer, and so you symbolize what happens in a story to meet your need. Maybe you want to know whether or not you should marry a particular southern girl that you met, and you read in the Bible that the Queen of the South came up to meet Solomon. That's not God telling you that you need to marry that woman. That's not the point of that story, and it would be wrong to over-allegorize, or allegorize at all, this historical narrative. The third trap is what I call the perspective trap. And that's reading our knowledge back into the original character's position. We are incredibly privileged to have the New Testament and its theology at our disposal, including the Old Testament and its theology at our disposal. But the characters in the Bible don't necessarily have all that information. For example, in the early part of the book of Acts, there's this event called the Day of Pentecost. Now we know, looking back with New Testament theology, that at the Day of Pentecost, God was setting aside his program with Israel and starting a brand new thing with his new body called the church. But the Christians back then didn't know that. In fact, they considered themselves primarily Jewish, and they still met in synagogues, and it took them a while to figure out that they were a brand new thing. This didn't come later till the Apostle Paul started to minister. So hopefully we can avoid these pitfalls. And now let's move on to actually how do you interpret a historical narrative. First, read the story slowly and carefully. There's a lot in the text that you might not remember from Sunday school class. Secondly, read what happens before the story and what happens after the story. In fact, this should start to sound familiar. We say this a lot, that if you don't understand a passage, read it again, read before it, and read it afterward, because context is so important. Thirdly, find the place of this story in the book. It's impossible for any historian to write everything that happened. Every historian has to be selective, and this includes the biblical historians as well. So make sure you ask questions like, why did the author include this story? what part does it play in the book that I'm reading? Fourthly, consider God's character. The main protagonist, the main hero in every story in the Bible is God himself. So when you read a story, ask, what can I learn about God from this account? Next, this is an important step, principalize what happens. Now that's just a fancy word for abstracting out principles or the reasons why characters did things. Summarize what the main characters did and then ask the question, why did they do these things? Until you get a principle or a lesson that you can apply to your own life. And lastly, make sure you cross-reference. Don't come up with some brand new lesson that you learn by reading some historical narrative and then apply that even though there's no other basis for you to do so with the rest of the scripture. Lastly, read 1 Samuel chapter 15 on your own. There you can practice a lot of the things that we've been talking about. It's in that story that you'll learn lessons about the justice of God, how God takes sin very seriously. You'll also learn about the obedience and compassion of the prophet Samuel. You'll also learn from the bad example of Saul, how he learned that partial obedience is really disobedience, and read about the mess he got himself into by blaming his mistake on others and refusing to do what God had told him to do.